My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore, and for 8 years, I have lived a double life. By day, I am the quiet head librarian at the Madison Street Library in Boston, Massachusetts. People see me in the same way they have for years. I move between the shelves in soft-soled shoes, reshelving books and dusting the tops of tall cases. I spend hours cataloging rare first editions and curating reading lists for university students who wander in, clutching half-finished coffee cups. My cardigan sweaters are plain, my skirts conservative, my hair tied neatly back. To anyone watching, I am the image of quiet scholarship, a woman content with the predictable rhythms of the library. No one suspects that behind my calm voice and gentle smile lies an empire worth nearly $14 billion. My public life is so unassuming that even the regular patrons barely remember my name. The older gentlemen who come in every morning, for the newspapers call me Miss Whitmore because it feels polite, not because they know much about me. The graduate students who ask for help finding obscure reference material only notice my ability to track down exactly what they need, never guessing that the same woman who knows where to find a 1923 botanical atlas also happens to control investment portfolios that influence stock prices in New York, London, and Frankfurt. It began most unexpectedly. 8 years ago, the library sent me to London for an international literary conference. I had been asked to present a paper on the preservation of fragile 18th century manuscripts. My presentation went well, and afterward, a friend from my graduate school days invited me to a dinner party at a townhouse in Mayfair. The townhouse belonged to her uncle, a discreet but very successful investor with interests in both America and Europe. His name was Henry Latham. Over dinner, we spoke about the parallels between curating a rare book collection and curating a portfolio of investments. He told me that in both cases, the key was patience, precision, and the ability to see value where others saw nothing of consequence. I had always been comfortable with numbers. Long before I became a librarian, I spent hours analyzing trends in the stock market purely as a hobby. Henry asked me if I had ever considered making real investments. I admitted that I had saved a modest amount over the years, money that had simply sat in a Boston savings account earning almost nothing. He offered to introduce me to a broker who specialized in discrete, high-yield opportunities. I said yes. That yes changed everything. At first, the investments were modest. A few $1,000s were placed in a small European tech firm that most people in America had never heard of. Then a stake in an American logistics company that was quietly acquiring warehouses along the eastern seaboard. Within a year, my returns were so impressive that I reinvested everything. Over the next 3 years, those careful, calculated moves turned my modest savings into millions. I registered a private holding company in Delaware, one of the quietest places in America for such operations, and began acquiring controlling interests in firms across the Atlantic. My friend's uncle became my unofficial mentor, though he never fully realized just how far I would take his advice. By the 4th year, I had formed a network of trusted managers in New York and London, each of them reporting to me through encrypted channels. We operated without publicity. There was no glossy office with my name on the door, no photographs in the financial press. My firm did not even have a formal name in the public sense. To the outside world, it was a shadow, a series of interconnected companies and trusts, many of them registered in jurisdictions where secrecy was a legal right. To me, it was simply my empire. While my financial life grew into something vast and formidable, my family's opinion of me never changed. I was born into the Whitmore family, an old name in New York society. My father built Whitmore Capital into a respected investment house in the 1980s, and my mother came from a publishing dynasty. My older brother, Charles Whitmore III, inherited the family business when my father retired. Charles was everything the society pages liked to photograph. Tall, charismatic, always dressed in tailored suits, he was the image of Wall Street success. He drove a silver Bentley, hosted extravagant dinners at his Fifth Avenue penthouse, and had his photograph taken at charity galas in both New York and London. To Charles, I was a curiosity, the quiet little sister who had chosen a career that barely paid more than a secretary's salary. He liked to remind me of it, often in the presence of others, with a smile that seemed like harmless teasing. Eleanor could have joined the family firm, he would say, but she prefers card catalogs and dusty old novels. Everyone would laugh politely. I would smile as if I had heard the joke before, which I had, countless times. What Charles did not know was that his empire, the pride of the Whitmore name, was worth less than a quarter of mine. The irony never failed to amuse me. I would leave those glittering dinners, step into the back of a taxi, and return to my apartment in Boston, where my real work began. While my neighbors watched television or walked their dogs, I would sit at my desk under the soft light of a green-shaded lamp, reviewing quarterly reports from companies in California, Texas, Germany, and the United Kingdom. I signed off on acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the same calm focus I brought to reshelving a rare edition of Jane Austen's letters. Part of me believes that my success came from the fact that I never approached it with the ego of someone trying to be seen. I never needed to impress a boardroom or justify a risky decision to a panel of directors. Every move I made was calculated solely on merit and potential. I could afford to think in years rather than quarters. I could pass on deals that looked flashy but lacked depth. And I could quietly buy into companies that were ignored by larger firms because their potential was not immediately obvious. The Madison Street Library provided the perfect cover. Its quiet atmosphere allowed me to think clearly, and no one ever questioned why I kept a laptop in my office. They assumed I was updating the library's catalog, not orchestrating a transatlantic merger. The staff saw me as the dependable head librarian who arrived early, left late, and always had time to help a student struggling with a research project. The truth was that I often signed deals during my lunch break, eating a sandwich while finalizing agreements worth more than most of my colleagues' lifetimes of earnings. The longer I maintained both lives, the more I realized how much power there is in being underestimated. My family's condescension, my colleagues' mild curiosity, and society's dismissal of librarians as harmless custodians of books all worked in my favor. I was invisible to the world that might have otherwise tried to stop me or compete with me directly. I let Charles believe that he was the pinnacle of ambition in the Whitmore family, because his arrogance made him careless, and careless people leave openings for those who know how to look. I also learned that wealth, when truly vast, changes the way you think about it. In the beginning, I tracked every dollar, every percentage point of return. But as the numbers grew into billions, the money itself became less important than the influence it represented. I could shape markets quietly. I could redirect supply chains. I could fund research projects or shutter entire operations without ever stepping into the spotlight. My name was never on the press releases, yet my signature was on the orders that made them happen. And still, every morning I returned to the library. I walked past the circulation desk, greeted the security guard, and unlocked my office door. I breathed in the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. The library was not just a cover. It was the part of my life that kept me grounded. Among the books, I was not Eleanor Whitmore, financial architect of a global empire. I was simply Eleanor, the woman who loved stories and believed in the preservation of knowledge. The people who came to the library saw me as reliable, approachable, and safe. That was exactly how I wanted it. In their eyes, I was a fixture, as permanent and unremarkable as the marble steps outside the building. And in that unremarkable space, I could plan moves that would change the course of companies, industries, and fortunes. Looking back, I realized that the seeds of my empire were planted in that Mayfair townhouse, but the roots took hold in the quiet corners of the Madison Street Library. The shelves became my walls of secrecy, the reading rooms my war rooms, and the card catalog a kind of metaphor for the order I brought to the chaos of international finance. I had found a way to live in two worlds at once, and no one, not my family, not my colleagues, not the business press, had the faintest idea. For 8 years, I have perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. I am the librarian they overlook, the sister they underestimate, and the investor they never see coming. And that is exactly how I intend to keep it. 3 weeks ago, I received a piece of information that shifted everything. It came to me in the same way most important news in my world does, quietly, discreetly, and through channels no one would ever associate with me. A coded message from my managing partner in New York, delivered through our private encrypted server, stated that Charles was deep in negotiations to acquire North Point Systems, a major American tech firm with operations in both California and London. North Point Systems was no ordinary acquisition target. They had a reputation for building advanced cloud infrastructure platforms and proprietary AI-based logistics tools used by both Fortune 500 companies and European governments. Owning them would place the buyer at the forefront of two of the most profitable sectors in modern business: cloud technology and intelligent supply chain systems. The deal Charles was pursuing was valued at $8.2 billion. I learned that he had been working on it for nearly a year, courting North Point's executives with the full weight of the Whitmore Capital name. He had flown to San Francisco twice for private meetings, hosted North Point's CEO at his Fifth Avenue penthouse, and even arranged for their top engineers to be invited to a luxury retreat in the Hamptons. I sat back in my desk chair at the Madison Street Library and let the information sink in. The thought of Charles parading in front of the financial press, basking in praise for pulling off a transformative deal, was almost unbearable. Not because I begrudged him success, but because I knew how fragile his victories were. They were built on bravado, showmanship, and the assumption that no one would dare move against him. I am not driven by the same need to be seen. My motivations are quieter, but sharper. And in this case, the temptation to act was too strong to resist. I reached for my phone, the one kept locked in my office safe when not in use, and dialed the number of my senior managing partner, David Hawthorne. David is one of only two people in the world who know the true scope of my holdings. He is a man who understands discretion so completely that I have never once heard him use my name in connection with any of our dealings. "David," I said once he answered, "we are going to buy North Point Systems." There was no hesitation in his voice, only the slight intake of breath from someone who knew what this meant. "Understood. Timeline?" "Before Charles signs," I replied. "That gives us less than 2 weeks." 2 weeks was an ambitious time frame for any acquisition, let alone one of this magnitude. But I had something Charles did not: the ability to move with absolute secrecy and without the burden of corporate bureaucracy. My network of shell companies and investment vehicles spanned continents. I could shift billions in hours, not days. David and I began that same afternoon. The first step was to make quiet contact with North Point's CEO, Michael Redford, a man whose reputation for caution was well earned. He had been steering North Point toward a deal with Whitmore Capital because it offered stability and visibility, but I suspected that what he truly valued was certainty. Through a mutual contact in London, a solicitor I had worked with during a discreet buyout of a European energy company, I arranged for a private meeting with Redford. We met in the early morning at an unmarked office in Mayfair, far from the gleaming boardrooms of the city. I arrived with no entourage, no obvious signs of wealth, only a slim leather folder containing the essentials of my offer. "Mr. Redford," I began once we were seated, "I am prepared to acquire North Point Systems in full for $8.4 billion in a combination of cash and equity. No syndicates, no external financing. The funds are already in position, and the agreement can be signed in 72 hours. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense his interest. I continued, explaining that my firm, though nameless in the public eye, had a history of leaving acquired companies operationally independent. There would be no aggressive restructuring, no media parade, no culture shifts to please shareholders. In short, I was offering him speed, security, and control. 3 hours later, Redford called me directly. "If your terms are genuine," he said, "and the funds are in place, I will sign." They were, and he did. The transfer of $8.4 billion was executed through a coordinated series of moves involving accounts in Luxembourg, Zurich, and New York. Each tranche was disguised within broader portfolio transactions, the kind that draw no attention from market analysts. By the time Charles was sitting down for what he thought would be his final meeting with North Point's board, the company had already signed an exclusive agreement with me. The official paperwork was filed in both California and London within the same hour. My attorneys ensured that every clause was airtight, every regulatory requirement met. There would be no way for Charles to contest the purchase without exposing details of his negotiations that he would rather keep private. I was in my office, at the library, when the first news alert appeared on my phone. Breaking. North Point Systems acquired in surprise private deal. The headline was followed by speculation from industry reporters. Who was the buyer? Why had they moved so quickly? Why had Whitmore Capital's widely publicized negotiations fallen apart at the last moment? Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then came a call from my cousin Victoria, which I also ignored. I knew the questions they would ask, and I was not ready to answer them. Not yet. Charles, of course, was blindsided. From what I later heard, he had walked into the North Point boardroom expecting a ceremonial signing. Instead, the chairman informed him, with visible discomfort, that the company was no longer available. An offer had been accepted from another party. When he pressed for details, they declined to reveal the buyer's identity, citing confidentiality agreements. Reporters gathered outside his office within hours. Footage aired on CNBC showing him brushing past cameras, jaw tight, refusing to comment. Analysts dissected the collapse of his deal, some suggesting that Whitmore Capital had overplayed its hand, others theorizing that a larger competitor had swooped in at the last minute. No one considered the possibility that it had been orchestrated by someone they had never even seen in the financial press. That evening, as I locked up the library, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. I did not need to gloat or broadcast my success. The act itself was enough. I had stepped into my brother's carefully staged moment and rewritten the ending without anyone even realizing I was there. But as I walked home through the cool Boston evening, I also knew this was not the end of the matter. Charles would not let this go. His pride had been wounded in public, and someone, he did not yet know who, had made him look careless. When the truth eventually came out, the fallout would be far more personal than anything I had faced before. For now, though, I allowed myself the luxury of silence. Only David knew the full scope of what had happened, and he would say nothing. The press could speculate. Charles could stew in frustration, and North Point could settle comfortably into my portfolio. I poured myself a glass of wine that night and sat in the bay window of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker. The librarian in me took quiet pleasure in the neatness of it all. The precision, the timing, the perfect alignment of opportunity and execution. It was not just a victory. It was a reminder of what I could do when I chose to act. The business world was already buzzing with questions about the mysterious buyer of North Point Systems. I had no intention of answering them. Not yet. The time to reveal the truth would come soon enough. And when it did, it would be on my terms, in my place, with my family gathered to hear it all at once. For the moment, the silence was my shield, and the knowledge of my victory was mine alone. The day after the North Point deal closed, I decided the time had come to tell my family the truth. For years, I had allowed them to believe a version of me that was incomplete, a silhouette without depth or substance. They had accepted it easily because it fit the narrative they preferred, the quiet younger daughter, harmless and content with her small, book-filled life. The events of the past week had altered the balance. Charles would soon find out who had beaten him to the North Point acquisition, and I wanted him to hear it from me, not from a journalist or a whispered rumor. Chose my Boston penthouse as the stage for the reveal. The apartment, perched high above the Back Bay, was the one place where my public image and my private reality coexisted. From the street, the building appeared elegant but not ostentatious. Inside, my home was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling, windows that opened onto sweeping views of the Charles River and the gold dome of the State House. A rooftop garden overflowed with herbs, roses, and potted olive trees I had shipped from Italy. The rooms were filled with carefully chosen art, antique furniture, and, of course, a private library containing rare volumes from both America and Europe. I called my mother first. "I'd like to have the family over for dinner this Friday," I told her. "It has been too long since we've all been in the same room." She was delighted and immediately asked if it was for my birthday. I let her believe it was, though my birthday was still 2 weeks away. My father agreed to come without hesitation. Charles's acceptance came later, terse and suspiciously quick. My cousin Victoria, who lived in Chicago and adored any excuse to fly east, confirmed within an hour. The days leading up to the gathering were unusually busy. I oversaw the menu with my chef, selecting dishes that were elegant but understated. I ordered champagne from my cellar, bottles so rare that most sommeliers would have taken photographs just to prove they had handled them. The wine pairings were chosen from vintages I had collected during discreet trips to vineyards in Bordeaux and Napa. My florist filled the rooms with white peonies and deep green foliage, the kind of arrangements that feel both lush and restrained. The evening of the dinner. The sun dipped low over the river, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. I wore a simple black silk dress and no jewelry except for a single diamond ring, a piece so old its value lay more in its provenance than its carats. By the time the first guest arrived, the penthouse was glowing with candlelight, and the air carried the warm scent of rosemary bread baking in the kitchen. Charles was the first through the door, arriving 15 minutes early as he often did, when he wanted to exert control. He wore a dark suit, perfectly cut, and carried himself with the restless energy of someone who had not slept well. I greeted him with a glass of champagne, which he accepted without comment. "You've heard? About North Point, I'm sure," he said almost immediately, his voice tight. "I've read the headlines," I replied mildly, steering him toward the terrace. "It was a hostile move," he continued, his jaw set. "Some corporate vulture swooped in at the last minute and took the deal from under me. No warning, no negotiation, completely unethical." I sipped my champagne, offering nothing. His words were heavy with frustration, but beneath that was a sharper edge. Humiliation. My parents arrived next, my mother in a pale blue dress and my father in a navy blazer. They were all smiles, oblivious to the undercurrent between Charles and me. Victoria swept in last, wearing a bright scarf and exuding her usual warmth. Within minutes, everyone had a drink in hand and the living room filled with the hum of polite conversation. We began with appetizers in the library. The guests admired the leather-bound volumes and the polished mahogany shelves, assuming, as always, that my love of books was the entirety of my world. Charles barely glanced at them, pacing near the window instead. His mind was elsewhere, and I knew exactly where. Dinner was served in the main dining room, a long table set with crystal, silver, and cream linen. The first courses passed without incident, though I caught Charles glancing at his phone twice. My father asked me about the library's current renovation project. My mother told a story about a charity luncheon, and Victoria regaled us with tales from her latest trip to London. It was over the main course, roast lamb with rosemary, and a side of wild mushrooms, that I decided to speak. I set down my glass and looked at Charles directly. "There is something I would like to share. With all of you," I began. The conversation quieted. My mother smiled expectantly, clearly thinking this was leading to a personal announcement. "Charles," I said, "you've been wondering who bought North Point Systems." His expression hardened, and I could feel the tension ripple through the room. "The mysterious buyer," I continued, "is standing right here." For a moment, no one moved. My mother's eyes widened, her smile faltering. My father's hand, halfway to his wineglass, froze in the air. Victoria blinked in confusion. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the point. Then I began to speak, telling them everything, though not in the language of balance sheets or acquisition strategies. I explained how 8 years ago, during a trip to London, I had made my first private investments, how those modest beginnings had grown into a network of holdings across America and Europe, how I had built a private equity firm so discreet it operated without a name, and how that firm now controlled assets worth $14 billion. Their faces shifted as I spoke. My mother's disbelief gave way to dawning recognition. My father's reserved expression softened into something like pride, and even Victoria's wide-eyed amazement held a note of admiration. Charles, however, remained still, his gaze fixed on me. I could see the calculations behind his eyes, the struggle to reconcile the sister he had dismissed for years with the woman who had just outmaneuvered him in the most public way possible. His jaw tightened, but there was no anger in his expression now, only the reluctant acknowledgement that I had beaten him fairly and completely. When I finished, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Then my father raised his glass. To Eleanor, he said quietly, his voice steady. To the sister, the daughter, and the woman none of us truly knew. Until now. The others followed, glasses clinking softly in the candlelight. Charles lifted his as well, though he did not take his eyes off me. It was not exactly a truce, but it was an unspoken recognition. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange, new balance. My mother asked questions about my investments, my father spoke of potential opportunities, and Victoria laughed at the idea of me running a global empire from behind a library desk. Charles remained reserved, offering no more complaints about North Point. But I could tell he was already thinking about what this meant for the future. For him, for the family, and for the dynamics that had defined us for so long. As the guests departed, the air outside had turned cool and the lights of Boston shimmered against the river. I stood at the door, watching them leave, knowing that nothing would ever be quite the same again. When the elevator doors closed behind the last guest, I returned to the library, poured myself one final glass of champagne, and stood before the shelves. The night had gone exactly as I had planned. I had taken control of the narrative, revealed the truth on my terms, and shifted the balance of power in a single evening. Yet I also knew this was only the beginning. The revelation had changed the playing field, but the game was far from over. Charles would come back, perhaps with offers, perhaps with challenges. The others would see me differently now, not just as Eleanor the librarian, but as Eleanor the architect of an empire. I was ready for all of it. In the days that followed the dinner, the story began to spread. It did not happen all at once. It began with whispers among my family's friends in New York, then a vague mention in a Boston financial column that a private buyer had taken North Point Systems from under Whitmore Capital's nose. By the third day, the speculation had reached the business press in earnest. My name appeared in print for the first time, alongside phrases like discreet powerhouse and unexpected titan of private equity. The first major article came from a senior journalist at the New York Times who had covered Whitmore Capital for over a decade. His piece was measured but unmistakable in its focus. It described me as a head librarian whose quiet demeanor concealed one of the most sophisticated private financial networks in the transatlantic market. He stopped short of publishing numbers, but his sources had an idea. Within hours, my inbox was flooded. Some messages were predictable: proposals from investment banks, invitations to closed-door conferences in London and New York, and requests for media interviews. Others were more surprising: discreet inquiries from European ministers about infrastructure funding, an overture from the head of a large American university regarding an endowed chair, and even a personal note from the curator of a major London museum hinting at an acquisition they hoped I might support. The financial blogs moved faster and with less restraint. One site posted an article titled "The Librarian Who Outplayed Wall Street," complete with a photograph of the Madison Street Library's facade and a caption calling it the headquarters of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Another featured a grainy picture of me at a book fair in Paris, standing in front of a display of rare poetry volumes, as if the image itself were proof that I could not possibly be what they claimed. The coverage amused me. They wanted a narrative that would fit neatly into their headlines: the humble woman who had risen overnight, the sudden revelation, the dramatic upset. But the truth was far less theatrical. I had been building this for 8 years. There was nothing sudden about it. On the fourth day, Charles called me. It was late in the evening, after the library had closed and the streets outside were wet from a light rain. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "What happened with North Point? It doesn't have to be the start of a war. There are opportunities where we could work together." I could hear the effort it took for him to say the words. Charles was not a man who liked sharing control, and certainly not with me, but he was pragmatic when it suited him. "I'm open to discussing it," I told him, my voice even. "But you understand that if we do this, the structure will be mine. You can bring your resources, but the terms are set on my side." A pause, then a low exhale. "We'll talk." I knew he would not back away from the idea. His pride might resist, but the logic was undeniable. Partnering with me would give him access to resources and influence beyond anything he had handled alone. And for me, there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that the brother who once dismissed me as a harmless, bookish figure now sought my partnership on my terms. The next morning, I was back at the Madison Street Library by 8 o'clock. The building was still cool from the night air, and the scent of old paper and polished wood greeted me as I stepped inside. I unlocked my office, hung my coat on, the same hook I had used for years, and turned on my desk lamp. There was a shipment waiting for me, a collection of 19th century French poetry from a small dealer in Paris. I examined the bindings, the delicate gilt work, and the crisp, almost untouched pages. As I catalogued each volume, I felt the familiar calm settle over me. Here, surrounded by books, the noise of the financial world faded. Students filtered in as the morning wore on, stopping at the desk to ask for help locating sources for their research papers. One young man needed a specific edition of a history text. Another was searching for references for his dissertation on European trade in the early 20th century. I guided them as I always had, answering their questions with the same patience I had shown long before I made my first investment. None of them had any idea that the woman stamping their library cards had moved billions of dollars across continents less than a week ago, and I preferred it that way. The anonymity was not a disguise, it was a choice. In the afternoons that followed, I kept to my usual routine. I reviewed acquisitions in my private office at home, held brief encrypted calls with David, and approved a handful of smaller transactions that had been in progress before the North Point move. I also began sketching the outline of a project that had been in the back of my mind for years, a global literacy foundation that could operate quietly, funding libraries and archival preservation in both America and Europe. It would be the one public-facing venture attached to my name, but even then, its true scope would remain understated. The attention from the press began to shift after the first week. Another corporate acquisition took over the headlines, and the librarian billionaire story became a curiosity rather than a front-page sensation. That suited me perfectly. I had no interest in building a public profile. My work was most effective when it was invisible. Still, the shift in my personal life was undeniable. My parents began calling more often, sometimes just to ask my opinion on small matters. My mother, who had once spoken of my library work in the gently patronizing tone reserved for charming hobbies, now listened carefully when I spoke about business. My father, too, seemed more at ease with me, as if recognizing that my choices had been deliberate and not the result of missed opportunities. As for Charles, his calls were cautious but consistent. We spoke about market trends, potential ventures, and the mechanics of cross-Atlantic partnerships. He did not mention the dinner directly, nor the look on his face when I revealed the truth, but the memory of it lingered between us. There was a new balance, one I intended to maintain. One evening, about 2 weeks after the reveal, I found myself alone in my penthouse library. The city lights shimmered across the river, and the air carried the faint scent of the olive trees. From the terrace, I stood at the tall windows, a glass of wine in hand, thinking about the two lives I had built. On one side, there was Eleanor the librarian, quiet, methodical, a guardian of books and knowledge. This life grounded me. It reminded me of the value of patience, of the importance of small, deliberate acts. On the other side, there was Eleanor the empire builder, a strategist moving unseen across the corridors of global finance, shaping the direction of companies and markets. This life challenged me. It tested my resolve, my vision, and my ability to remain several steps ahead of those who underestimated me. I had no desire to choose between them. The balance between the two was not a compromise. It was the source of my strength. The librarian kept the empire builder from losing herself in power. The empire builder ensured the librarian would never be dismissed again. In the quiet of that evening, I understood something else as well. My greatest advantage had never been the size of my assets or the secrecy of my operations. It was the fact that I had mastered the art of being underestimated. People looked at me and saw what they expected to see, and I let them. As I set my wine glass down and returned to the desk, I glanced at the stack of unread manuscripts waiting for cataloging. Tomorrow, I will return to the library, open the doors at 8 o'clock, and greet the students as if nothing in my life had changed. And in the evenings, I would continue to build, to acquire, to move billions quietly across oceans. I would remain both Eleanor the librarian and Eleanor the empire builder. Quietly powerful, underestimated by most, but known to those who matter as someone never to be underestimated again.